everyone, and it's my very pleasant duty today to introduce and converse with my old friend Dominique Varma. We already know a little bit about her, but she's also very intimidatingly erudite, and not only has she studied classics and literature at the Sorbonne, she's also done an MA in Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. She's been teaching at the University of Lille and has lived in India and France for the last 2 decades.
3 decades.
Three decades, okay. She's co-edited a collection of essays called Memories of the Second Sex in 2000. Her first novel, Shifting Sands, was published in 2004, and After the Deluge took a whole 10 years in coming after that. So it's recently been published. Yeah, so we can perhaps begin with talking to Dominique about her first novel, Shifting Sands, which has a very disturbing subject. It has a very tormented character who commits suicide in Beeg in Rajasthan, and it is also parallelly the story of a Nazi concentration camp for children. So, Dominique, perhaps you would like us to know a little bit about how these two very disparate zones came together.
Yes, so there is what was the intention, and there is what became the unintentional. And in fact, the starting point was a painting of a woman I had seen in Rajasthan, in Deeg. This European woman was supposed to have committed suicide. And I was fascinated by the beauty of the woman. And I probably was more fascinated by the fact that she had committed suicide in this very beautiful place. So I decided to research on her. And I never did any research on her. I wrote the book. But when I started writing what became Elia's story, at the same time, since I had no plan, because I had not researched then, I saw images, other images, and my first image was like, and that was, I was writing in Delhi, a kind of hallucination of people walking in the snow. And since I had not yet planned a novel, I followed these images, and for some time it was as if I was writing 2 different stories. And clearly these people were walking in the snow towards a camp. And this came also from images, because I was in India, and 6-8 months before that, in Paris, I had seen an exhibition of drawings by children of the Theresienstadt in German, or Terezin in Czech camp. And this was a very special concentration camp, in the sense that it was a showcase, it was the epitome of mystification, because it was a propaganda camp, and Hitler even did a film called We Have Given a City to the Jews, and there was this film, and it was to, of course, deceive the Red Cross, who would come and visit the camp. And so whatever was forbidden, of course, in all the camps, privation of liberty, but what was forbidden was, of course, to have a book, to write, to paint, and even to obviously step out of the fort, of the camp. was allowed for a few months in this experiment. So, and there were drawing lessons for the children. So in the space of a few months, these children were allowed to draw. And these drawings were supposed to be in what would have become the Jewish Museum after the war, when Hitler would have won the war. And so these drawings could not be burned in 1945, the liberation of the camp. So these drawings are there, and they are drawn by children who draw and paint princesses and dragons, but also what they were allowed to draw what they were seeing in the camp, so people hanging, people starving, beatings, and you see that in the drawings by these children. And I had a shock in Paris seeing that. And somehow I forgot these images totally. And suddenly when I decided to write the story of this woman who had committed suicide, there was this image of people walking in the snow and children. And I realized that I was myself drawing from these images. In fact, I had vivid memories of things I thought I had totally forgotten. And I started building stories about the children and other characters in the camp. And then I realized that these two parallel stories, I couldn't cope with that. I was in the middle of these two terrible stories, because one, Elia, is a story of a prisoner, but she herself is a prisoner of her own mind and desires, and that's one would think it's a better way of being a prisoner, of course, than being a prisoner in a concentration camp, where there is actually no escape. But it's a story of two prisons, and I was in the middle, like a medium, and that's how the three stories came together. Maybe this novel is more autobiographical because the narrator who says I is a woman in Paris, she does Sanskrit, and then she goes to India. But still it's a character. I mean, it's not me. Maybe me is what? One, a character of the camp, the actress Zelda, or even Elia herself. So, who is so decide to go to her death herself. So, of course, there's not only death in the story, because there are children and there are survivors. And one of the most important characters, Elias, the young boy in the camp, survives because he becomes a father of Elia, who is in the Rajasthan story. So the world is full of prisons. The world is full of escapes, and one should be very grateful to realize that we live in countries where we have the possibility of speaking our mind, of having the freedom of expression, the freedom to move, and in reality, in most countries in the world, what we take for granted, this kind of freedom do not exist, especially for women. But it's a journey towards freedom and towards liberation. Maybe that's my own journey within India. Well, you know, I sometimes say I'm twice born also. And certainly, yeah, my second birth was my connection, and a very deep connection to India. And maybe that's the world as it is now. We have connection with the world. We belong in a country, obviously, but our identity is made of several identities. And strongly for me. I found home here also. So,
yeah, so what I'm going to pick up, I mean, you've given so much rich material for us to pick up here. But what I'm going to pick up on is the use of the word medium that you use for yourself, you know, the writer as a kind of a medium, almost suggesting that these two stories were forced to come together because of some kind of an unconscious rather than a conscious process. Would you agree? That's
absolutely.
There
is no doubt.
How you feel about writing? Because there is a rather interesting passage, I thought, in Shifting Sands, which reflects on writing and the author. So, if I have your permission?
Sure.
So this reads like this. Today, the sparkling rain in the shadowy streets of Paris appears familiar and reassuring to me. I am acquainted with it. It cannot take me by surprise. I can walk at night in the damp streets, alone, free, no prohibitions. Life is there in front of me. All desires are permissible, but I am not able to recognize my desires. I recognize them only in the desire of others. I watch others desire me, and I burn with my own mysterious, unspeakable, incomprehensible yearnings. I see in them only suffering, heartaches, and seeds of sorrow. Well, I thought this was quite complex and interesting because you are really talking about the role of writing here and the role of the writer to the world. How would you respond to something like this? I mean, how do you see your relationship to writing?
Yeah, there is a relationship. By the way, should I read?
The passage? Yes, I think so.
Maybe in French?
Sorry.
One second. Don't remember when exactly you started, but maybe I will start with that. Aujourd'hui, la pluie qui fait étinceler les ténèbres des rues à Paris me paraît familière, rassurante. Je la connais. Elle ne peut pas me prendre par surprise. Je peux marcher la nuit dans les rues humides, seule, libre, pas d'interdiction. La vie est là, simple, tous les désirs sont permis, mais je ne sais pas reconnaître mes désirs. Je ne les reconnais que dans ceux des autres. Je regarde les autres, me désirer, et moi, je brûle de mes désirs mystérieux, inqualifiables, incompréhensibles. Je ne vois en eux que souffrance, blessure au cœur, germe de peine déjà éclose. I think you stop there, right? Il y a une relation au désir, et en fait, mon Sable mouvant or Shifting Sands, we're discussing about that, is a much more sexual book, if I may say, because obviously desire is sexual desire, but desire is a very important tool, I would say, in Indian philosophy, because lots of things are desire, and sometimes sexual desire for some people is not the most important desire, strangely, though it is obviously important. And desire, which I can't recognize myself, I mean, or the I, the narrator, who cannot recognize her desires, see her desires expressed by other characters. So it's like living by proxy and freeing oneself from transgressions, inhibitions, Yeah, that can be very convenient for the writer. I realized, in fact, that in the Bangalore Literary Festival where I was, many of the writers would read very heavy sexual passages, 2 pages of homosexual love, heterosexual love in details. And I think the audience seems to like that, but again, it's because you're living in a free country and you can do that. And somehow my second novel is, unfortunately, much less sexual. It's not, maybe it's age, the time, or maybe it's because the research took me into a world more into death than pleasure. And in fact, this suffering, which is life, you know, we are caught between suffering and the desire for pleasure. And sometimes the desire for pleasure brings suffering, we know that, so it's called love. I mean, I didn't want to remain in the sensuous. Maybe Shifting Sands is really in the realm of the sensuous. Probably after the deluge is less, maybe because the narrator this time is a man. I thought it would liberate me, that in a way I would not identify with the narrator, the man, the male narrator, but maybe his counterpart, the girlfriend, his artist girlfriend Nora, is going deeper into madness more than the character Elia in the Rajasthan story. So also I sort of exorcise this fear of madness in the character of Nora, again drawn to death and suicide in a very different way. But again, I decided something, and this something was characters who are very much into art, architecture, but also non-violence and Tibetan and Buddhist philosophy. And it's there. And I wouldn't say that I wanted to do a kind of propaganda for Buddhist philosophy or even Tibet, but seemed to me that in the kind of world we are living, we are very far from ahimsa, non-violence, we are very far from satyam, truth. So sometimes it's good to say things, and maybe that's one, I would say, a responsibility of a writer at the conscious level, because again the subconscious takes over. I mean, this is what happened to me. So I was sort of hijacked and kidnapped by another part of the story, and maybe that was a subconscious, which came to me in the form of history and my original plan for after the deluge. Maybe we can go back to Shifting Sands or another scene after. But the idea is the conundrum of our life, and I'm speaking for myself, but I guess for many people also, is how can one practice non-violence in a world which is so violent and which is maybe becoming even more violent, even sliding into chaos. So, and a world where reason and reasoning, which should be the characteristic of the human mind, seem to be totally forgotten in some propaganda and insistence on emotions and words being used just to brainwash people. Because words, in fact, all wars are waged with words first. And word is a very important element of all wars. So I mean, I don't want to say something so heavy, but that's a fact. I don't think that can be denied. And so, even if we don't want to be part of this war of words, when one writes, one is on the battlefield. That was my experience from my second book, Battlefield. And that's why maybe it took so long, and I did so much research and history, and how history in the second book, because I was stunned by what I was discovering about this painter who was not even a character of the original plan, Nicolas Rory, who is important but sort of forgotten in India. What I discovered by research changed the course of the novel, partly the course of my life. And I don't know, and we are talking about the subconscious, if it was not this enterprise where I found myself under a kind of spell, if it was not a kind of death wish on my part, that was Thanatos knocking at the door, and I was there alone. So I had to fight for many years, and again, with naivety, I thought that one was allowed, even if in democratic countries, to search for the truth, to try and express truth. But in fact, truth is something which is very disturbing. And my characters, fictional characters, are disturbed by the truth or the elements of truth which they discover. And it changes the story like it changed, I would say, my life. I don't know how much of a deep digression I got about the process of writing and being a medium. But certainly, as you say, again I was in the middle of all that, and I was fighting for my sanity in the middle of all that.
Yeah, you're saying something quite intriguing for our audience, that it changed not just the novel but also your life, and characters you never intended entered this novel. So, and you're also talking about it, distinction between the two novels, and I can see why you're saying that, but I also see very strong links, and you use the word exorcise, and I'm wondering if anything is actually exorcised, or is it in fact returning in a more magnified form in the second novel or not. So just some of these...
You mean returning what sounds like a boomerang?
Like a returning of the death wish. I thought that's what we're talking about here.
Well, I do think, I not realize that while I'm saying that with insight. There is something which I have not simply realized as such, that history, again, is an element of the war of words. And there is no innocent history. And that's why people can continue negate, even facts or documented events. One wonders also, finally, what is the use of history when, especially in our times, when we have so many possibilities of verifying information, confronting aspects of information that we can quickly check. Why is it that the same ideologies of terror, why is it that I've not heard personally anyone saying, concentration camp is something fantastic. I've never heard that. But it's true that there are people who think so. Otherwise, we wouldn't live in a world where there are camps. There are still concentration camps in many countries. And normally everybody says, oh, it's awful, it's terrible, torture, etc. And not only that, but people are sent to these labor camps sometimes just because they write books, by the way, or because they write poems. And that is happening now. So my question is, with so much proof, with so much evidence, why humanity as a whole, I'm not separating myself from, we're not separating ourselves from the whole of humanity. Why is humanity so inhuman? I don't know what kind of responsibility the writers have in this question. Because we could all agree on that. We could all agree on the fact that maybe exchanging on art, on books, I mean, you can criticize, don't like it, but it's about exchanging and on keeping some values and common values. And still, where is the moral progress? We don't see it. We don't see it. I'm not saying that it should be the goal of literature. Literature or poetry or philosophy could be art for itself, just a pleasure of words. But if one says that, you know, the art for art exists, even poetry is a weapon. I'm sorry to say, because otherwise poets wouldn't be sent, would not have been sent, for instance, to the Gulag, just because they have written poems. And that has happened, because this can't be denied. And this can happen now. So, I must say that I'm not really reflected on that, which has, in fact, politicized me, in a way. You know, I thought that you have to write and try to please yourself, because there is a pleasure in writing, there is a pleasure about words, you know, finding what you think is a nice word, and I like poetry very much. So there is this element of pleasure, but there are different layers of meaning, like all the meanings and all the stories in which I've been involved, even against my will or my consciousness, and I feel more responsible for that. I do think that somehow my stories are stories of prisons, whether it is a prison of the mind or actual prisons. And maybe when you write, you are a voice, sort of voice for the prisoners, you know. You like to be a voice for the prisoners of the world. And in that sense, it's being a medium without wanting to transmit a political message. But it's a writing, I realize, at my expense is a political act, and there is no innocent history, and people are can be very disturbed by the search for truth. And that truth, Satyam, is a value in India, you know, as a motto of the country. We're quite proud in France to have liberty, equality, fraternity, in that order, interestingly, as motto. And these are values. So you can always say, oh no, but we are not free. Yes, but liberty is an ideal. We are living in an imperfect world, and we have to aim at that, trying to find more freedom. but also, as I say, we take for granted that freedoms we enjoy and many other inhabitants of the planet just dream about. So, I don't know now. I would like to maybe go into more the pleasure of the words, which I mean, one can hope to share with some readers at least, than with heavy political, ideological fights.
I think that's a great idea. Why don't you read out the passage that you feel you'd like to share with our readers at this point?
Which one you mean, the camp? Or what? Which one?
You're talking about the pleasure of words, so you choose which one you prefer.
Okay. But then I will not choose the camp. Maybe I will write then. We'll read. So shall I read it again? So you want to read? Oh, you can.
You go ahead.
Okay. Love. I was ready to sell my soul to the devil if he had wanted it, in exchange for the supreme reward of sleeping and waking with Nora, and between these two frontiers of sleep, touching your skin softer than tears. I have not known a more violent drug. I was intoxicated under the savage grip of that love, incapable of control. I no longer belonged to myself, all will dissolved. My only residue of rationality limited itself to not revealing to her the intensity of my passion, but maybe it is here that I was wrong. I should perhaps have been less prudish. There is no defeat, no humiliation in love. There is only despair and fear. Short passage.
Thank you so much. I think we can ask them to open it to the audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So please feel free to ask Dominique any questions, observations that you might like.
There was a passage I wanted to read, but I mean, or you could read about in the second novel, arriving in Delhi, or maybe we could share that. Sure, that's all right. Because at the end of the novel, after the deluge, I mean, the last part, and because we have not talked much of these characters, the narrator Daniel and his son Jeremy are coming to Delhi, and Daniel's girlfriend Nora, the artist, has disappeared. Probably kidnapped either by the Russians or the English, but they know they are going to find Nora in India. And so they are going to India, and they are waiting to be contacted by the Indian intelligence. So it's a discovery of Delhi, I would say, not in a normal mindset of a tourist coming to Delhi, because they are waiting to be contacted. So maybe, I think we could share that if you want to read the beginning from a long, and then I think just 2 or 3, and I'll start. And this, and then I'll start the beginning of this, and I'll start that.
From a long way off, I caught sight of the white gopuram of the temple on the hill, and as we approached the wrought iron gate, I was overwhelmed by a strange nostalgia. A nostalgia for a time that I didn't even regret. Perhaps the memory of the years of wandering, uncertainty, and incompletion. Willingly or unwillingly, I had entered the era of achievement, completion, and life itself. I was out of the amniotic fluid of infinite possibilities and the virtuality of non-action. I had chosen to become somebody I wasn't even sure was really me. In birdsong and in the tinkle of the ritual bells, I felt quite calm walking up the temple steps. Jeremy was quite struck when he first saw a statue of Shiva, the great yogi with a perfect body, eyes half closed over a smile impervious to the vicissitudes of this world. The priest greeted us with polite restraint, a father and son pair in India. Family values still have the aura of a golden past. We circumambulated the shrines of the different gods, barefoot over the cool marble floor. It was the real beginning of our journey. A light breeze accompanied our steps, caressing our humid faces.
Respite by its very nature can be but short-lived. I was immersed in my metaphysical musings when I saw, climbing slowly towards us, he who I had so wanted to meet at the Paris Library. Dr. Singh, I murmured to Jeremy under my breath. I stood up hastily while Jeremy, camera in hand, stared at the newcomer. My car is at the gate. I'm really pleased that we meet in such an auspicious place and that you have brought your son along for his first visit to this haven of serenity. I'd be very happy to offer you a lift in my car. We'll be able to walk coolly in comfort. There was no question of refusing such a politely formulated invitation. A burly, muscular Sikh stepped out and opened the door for us, and we found ourselves ensconced in a very comfortable Maruti Suzuki ST. Dr. Singh turned to me and added with a knowing smile, "Great occasion to get Jeremy to do some sightseeing in New Delhi. We'll head towards Connaught Place." Jeremy started at hearing this name, while I just mentally repeated my impassibility exercises. He chose to avoid the ring road, and we passed by Lodi Garden and Khan Market. You've already seen Lodi Garden, I think, but Jeremy should maybe come back around sunset for the most flattering view. I nodded my head, coldly receiving 10 on 10 the message that our little touristy spin had not been unnoticed. I should have expected that. I suppose you must be quite eager to find out where Nora is. I limited my reaction to a faint, almost imperceptible movement of my chin. Well, thanks to us, she was able to go to Rishikesh for a brief but moving ceremony to consign Professor Basmanov's ashes to the Ganges. Now she's en route for Kulu. You are going to take her to the Roerich house? I interrupted. How is she? You know, our mental and physical states are not very stable. It was he who interrupted me this time. We are very mindful of Nora's health, perhaps much more than your English friends. Your English friends have first gone to Kalimpong. Let's say that we fed them a bit of information that turned out, unfortunately, to be inaccurate. Kalimpong has quite an aura, this nest of spies, as Pandit Nehru used to say. Mr. Maguire and Professor Boyle will surely enjoy their visit to Kalimpong, he said, with barely disguised satisfaction. As we turned to Connaught Place, he continued his aside to Jeremy about the places worth visiting in Delhi. The United Coffee House, he said, pointing to the pink and green facade. After a tour of the outer circle, we turned into Baba Road and the car moved towards an official bungalow with the Indian flag on the roof and a sentry box with heavily armed guards behind chest-high sandbags who saluted crisply as we went in case we had missed the point. This was confirmation that we had been touring Delhi in an official vehicle. I mean, it's a bit long.
So I think that gives us a good flavor of the book and also perhaps your relationship to India. No?
Right. Yes, right.
So shall we open it to the audience?
Yeah. Any question?
Oh, there's a question.
Yes, because the first question is always probably the most difficult. I'm just making an effort to ask you, but my question is in fact is to Nilofer Kaul. In spite of the pleasure, the literary pleasure we can feel reading Dominique Varma's book, what is your main interest reading the first and the second novel?
Oh, I hadn't anticipated that. Okay. What is my main interest? Call it my training. What I was looking for constantly were links between the two books. So what was intriguing me was the idea that there were in both stories, there was what was most present was the idea of something taking over the story. You know, that the story set out to be something, like even when Dominique was saying, I wanted to write a happy book or a book with a positive ending, but if you read them, they are not that at all. They are haunted, preoccupied with death, madness, suicide. So, yeah, so I think it's this kind of tussle between the light and the dark and this, you know, this demonic possession by something which was interesting for me.
Can I just add that the ending, I would say, I mean, maybe you wouldn't say that, but in both cases, I mean, it's a good ending, no? It's not so.
Dominique, I'm sorry if I hurt you.
Okay, good.
I have two questions. First, because of your spiritual development, you said the desires became less and less. Is it because of your spiritual upliftment?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Not sure I say that, but desire, I mean, it was kind of joke about sexual desire. It just so happened that I realized that because I reread this first book only recently, and I had not literally opened the book for the last 6 years. So I'm talking about the first book, Shifting Sands. I realized it was much more desire and sexual desire and sensuousness. And so I'm not sure, because a part, as you know, a spiritual way can include the sexual or sensuous into it. So it's not something which is, as you know, the Indian tradition is separate. I mean, it can go together very well. So I don't know, maybe this book is more somber because of the realization that history and the tragedies of history are looming. You know, that's maybe what that maybe we have not drawn enough lessons from all the tragedies of the 20th century. Or maybe we want to forget, we humans, we want to forget the tragedies and enjoy. But the 20th century has been traumatic. You know, there are very, very good things, but for everywhere, so much. And again, it seems we are heading towards a network of tragedies. So many people in this place that suffering. You can say it has always existed. We can live our life because we are not all the time thinking, oh, all these people are being tortured and killed. It's unbearable. So we have to think about our own pleasure and maybe give pleasure also to others. But perhaps we were hoping that the 21st century would be a kind of progress in terms of ethics, in terms of peace, in terms of more understanding, and that is where, because the communication is so much easier, of course there is this eternal debate about are there universal values, is liberty meaning the same thing for everybody, or are there people who, because of their tradition, shouldn't be allowed to be free, all this. This is not a new debate, by the way, but maybe this hope that because of the amount of information, evidence, and we could draw lessons from history, we could hope to become better. We can still hope to become better, because there are good people everywhere, but how to resist these trends and these waves of violence all over? Maybe it's my reading, I have a pessimist reading of the world, though the title of After the Deluge was meant to give a hope that, yes, there have been deluges and floods and catastrophes, and that we can overcome that. Let's not wait for the next deluge. So maybe we'll be in between, but we have to work hard for that. I don't know if I'm...
I have a second question. Because of the sufferings and this thing, why doesn't the government make laws in the country where we have freedom of expression to do something where all these negative things are going on, so that people do something for them? The countries which are free can make laws for the citizens to do something where there are a lot of prisons existed. Do something in some way.
But not like what? What do you mean?
The countries which are allowing freedom of expression and freedom, the citizens should be held responsible to do something for the countries where the people are suffering.
You mean the other countries?
Other countries.
But that's complicated and that geopolitics, yes.
I think a writer may not be the best person to pose this question.
No, because she knows about it. She understands about it.
I think she's really expressing powerlessness at the moment as a writer.
Oh, maybe not. I mean, I may sound like that. It may. I'm not saying it's a work of the writer. It's a work of the human being to fight these trends of violence. And in India, at a personal level, I found this combination as ideals of truth and non-violence, Satyam Ahimsa. Now, how? And I mean, of course, there are examples, not perfect again, in your history, that these two notions, very abstract notions, were political tools. I mean, that's how, I'm reading Gandhi and Nehru. And they were living in their world, because, by the way, Gandhi and Nehru and the Communist Party of that time, including Bose, etc., were the first party to denounce Nazism, in the 30s. At a time when the so-called intellectual, or the intellectual in Europe, were not aware, could not understand what was happening, So it's also, what I'm saying is, we should be able to read the present and try to live in the present with the ideals. It's very difficult. I mean, I can't give, I'm not someone who can to give lessons to other. I'm just trying myself to implement that. But yeah, you may say I'm not so pessimistic. In fact, I would say no. I sound maybe more.
Thank you so much for a fascinating journey into yourself, and so absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I would like to ask that you have written a book through the voice of a woman and another book through the voice of a man, the narrator. Were there times when it was difficult to, was the second one more difficult than the first? Were there times when you got stuck and you felt that it wasn't sounding, the interior voice there were some false notes? Were there times that it was difficult to think like the man narrator?
Strangely, in fact, I was telling Nilofer, after my first hesitations, the choosing of a male narrator somehow liberated me. I could enter his mentality. I don't know if he sometimes be a bit feminine. He's not the male chauvinist, certainly not. But I liked him. Maybe he's a man I would like to meet. So I may continue writing with him as a narrator. It's also a protection, I realize. Because first of all, the narrator is also me, as I say. I share many common points with the narrator of the first novel, there is no doubt. Somehow, the main narrator helped me keep a distance and exist, not be only a character myself of a novel, but I don't know what. Writer or author. I don't know how much I've answered your question, which is not so easy in fact. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank you for the talk, but more importantly, to remind all of us that our national motto is Satyamev Jayate. We had all forgotten, at least I had forgotten it consciously. I don't know how many of us remember it. And how does it translate into our everyday living as citizens of the country? Now, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Probably I'll ask you after the longer ones. But tell me, you mentioned that you had started off doing something, and then the unconscious took over. Which is very true about a lot of us. Though very often we do not consciously realize that the unconscious has taken over. We do not even think about the play between conscious and unconscious from a kind of a meta level. So when you first realized this, how did the realization happen? Did it happen during the course of writing the novel? Do you have some thoughts about free will, how we exercise free will, particularly with examples from writing the novel and things like that?
Strangely, I did not realize it that much. I was caught. When I say I've been kidnapped by Rory, in the same way as Nora, the character, is kidnapped, mentally I have been kidnapped. And I did not realize it. I was into this whirlpool, fascinated, like under a spell. I'm not exaggerating. And at that time, it's because discussing with Nilofer, and she pushed me into introspection, and more reflection on the two novels. But at that time, I didn't think it's subconscious. I have to find the truth of all that. I was deep into that, pushed, forgot. I didn't at that time think about, okay, this is my subconscious. It's much after that I realized that. I was totally taken. Too much. That's why when I say I can, it's, this novel has taken a toll on me, a psychological, heavy toll. And okay, I'm here now and probably looking more or less sane. I'm not asking the question to the analyst, but yes. In a way, my character Nora became mad, and it was a help for me to keep my sanity. But it was not clear. It was a subconscious at that time. I didn't have the distance to think. I don't know if you have other questions, or if you want to.
You mentioned that it took a psychological toll.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, experiences like this can also be very rewarding. Like, when you talk about insanity, sanity, or at least some internal conflict. I mean, that also probably opens up several possibilities. So, are you able to look at possibilities or rewards from this experience? Or do you already recognize some, or you're...
Yes. When you go through difficult times, and at some level you are a survivor, yes, it's a reward to have survived. You realize after that. I've met last year this Slovenian writer called Boris Pahor, who's turned 100, and who was interned in Mauthausen in concentration camp as an anti-fascist Italian. He was not Jewish. But even now, at the age of 98, 99, he talks a lot, he's very clear. The moment somehow he talks about the camp, he is ready to talk, speak of a topic. He considers himself a survivor. So I'm not comparing my experience, because as I say, being prisoner of your own obsessions or fears of dangers, because I've encountered real dangers while writing this novel. But I won't put that at the same level as an experience of being tortured in a camp. But he, after 60 years or even more, 70 years, he is a survivor. So the only good thing, he even says that he's pleased, he enjoys being a survivor. He in fact said a very interesting story, because I met him in Lille, and when he was liberated from Mauthausen, they was sent to Lille. So he was still wearing his clothes of the camp, and suddenly being free in the city. And the first night, he couldn't believe it. They had not given them even clothes. But the train took them to Lille. And he said, the first night I slept in fresh bed sheets. After 2 years he spent. And he said it was, and 60 years later, he was experiencing the softness of the bed sheets after spending 2 years in a camp. But it was so vivid. So, I suppose, all his life, and by the way, the fact that he took the political decision of writing in Slovenian and not in Italian, though he's a perfect Italian speaker. That was a political decision, and this political decision, because in fact he was one of the candidates for the Nobel Prize, and happy that Patrick Modiano got it. I'm not talking about this year, but what he writes is terrible. And even now, he is a survivor, but he's happy to be a survivor. So at my little level, what I've learned is to appreciate the humanity of people. I know that even in very difficult times, even if you are betrayed by people, there are other people, even unknown people, who help you. And this is something, in that sense, I am not so pessimistic, because I do believe that there is a goodness in human beings. Of course, it's not very obvious.
Are there any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dominique, and thank you for being a lovely audience. Thank you. No fire.
Madame No Fire, yes. Madame Varma, Madame Kaul, merci beaucoup. Merci infiniment. And